ACNFers. This podcast is brought to you by Casualty of Words, a writing podcast for people in a hurry, hosted by me. It is a short little daily podcast, Monday to Friday right now, just a little about snippets of writing and writing advice or inspiration. And the time it takes you to brush your teeth, you can listen to an episode of Casualty of Words. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And also, since I have a teensy bit more time on my hands, if you leave a review over at Apple Podcasts, for the Creative Nonfiction podcast, that is, this podcast, I'll give you a complimentary edit of a piece of your writing up to 2,000 words. Once your review posts, usually about 24 hours or so, send me a screenshot of your review to creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com, and I'll reach back out to get you started. And who knows, if you like the experience, you might even want me to help you out with something more ambitious.
Yeah, I always say, I may have made this analogy to you before, but it's like, I always say I'm like an outdoor cat. Like, I just can't go in again. Like, I just have seen the outside.
Hey CNFers, it's CNF Pod, the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, show where I speak to badass people about telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. How's it going? Leah Sottile, yes, she's back. Within a calendar year, I know, that's kind of bizarre. But when you have a year like she did last year, it's got to happen. What a 2022 she had with the release of her first book, When the Moon Turns to Blood. Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell, and a story of murder, wild faith, and end times. And she released another blockbuster narrative podcast, Burn Wild, put out by the BBC, produced with Georgia Cat. They present the story of two fugitive environmentalists, an eco-terrorist, and a burning question. How far is too far to go to save the planet? You might know Leah from Bundyville and 2 Minutes Past 9 and myriad long-form features for places like The Atavist, Outside Magazine, and the New York Times. And I highly recommend her Substack. It's free, but she accepts payment to help subsidize the amazing journalism she does. Yeah, it's sort of like this podcast. It's free, but it sure as hell ain't cheap. So go to patreon.com/CNFpod to pitch in. But her newsletter is wonderful. I look forward to it every time she puts out a missive. It's just like a, I don't know, 1,000-word essay, maybe a little longer, maybe a little shorter about stuff. I don't know, I dig it. I dig Leah. Okay? Is that so wrong? I can't say enough about her. Her writing, her voicing, her generosity, and her love of journalism and the power of narrative. She's a damn good potter as well. In fact, I've commissioned her to make me a mug. I wish I had a cool hobby besides getting blotto on IPAs 3 days a week. But here we are. One last thing. Don't forget to head over to BrendanO'Mara.com for show notes and to sign up for my Up to 11 Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Lots of cool stuff. Goodies, raffles, happy hours. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, can't beat it. So without further ado, I hate it when people say that. I don't know. Let's just do away with the ado. Here's Leah. Riff. Oh, man. Oh, I think this is a great way to dovetail into our conversation about, the Burn Wild, the story behind Burn Wild and so forth. But you said a little while ago, why do we do this? And maybe I should just ask you, Leah, why do we do this?
Oh man. Yeah, you got to start with that question. I mean, I do struggle quite a bit the further I get into my career with why I continue to do it, because the pay is not there, the jobs are not there, the sexy glossy magazine gigs are not there. I do, it's funny, I recently had a student in one of my classes ask me just so point blank, why write?
Oh yeah, it was in your newsletter. Yeah. Okay, listen, I get it. There is some degree of newsletter fatigue going on out there, and there's always a little joke around Substacks and the like. That said, subscribe to Leah's Substack. It's really, really good. It gives you a really nice insight into what she's thinking about in a given month. Really nice, just a really beautiful essay about just what it means to go about the work and do this kind of stuff. I look forward to it every time. Of course, there are paid tiers that you can elect to use to help subsidize some of the amazing journalism that she does, be it podcasts or in print. And you're going to learn soon enough in this podcast here about Burn Wild, which we'll get to in a moment. But I just really wanted to celebrate her newsletter. It's one of my favorites, and I really hope you'll subscribe to it. And mine.
Yeah, yeah, and it was just so funny the way I just answered. We were at a bar, and I was like, because I feel like I'm helping, and he just kind of cocked his head and looked at me and was like, "Who do you feel like you're helping?" And I was, I had to really think about it. And I mean, it's for every story, it's different, but I think it's just like this thing that you figure out from doing it. And there there are so many stories that I am not interested in and that I won't do, but it's like when I do find a story that I know, it's like I know it when I see it, like I and then I'm like, I don't even question why I make journalism when I'm working on a story that I believe in. Damn, there are so many barriers to getting there. Like I can't think of any other career that has so many reasons to not do it.
I know.
you know, just hitting you in the face every day. Like, you might not get paid. Like, you might, this story might get killed, or your sources might back out, or you're not going to get a job. I mean, and that is just so dispiriting sometimes. But
And some of that is fine when you
generally,
have like say a staff gig where where your salary is steady and you're like, okay, if someone pulls out, like, okay, fine, I'll move on the next thing, at least I'm still getting paid. But when you're doing it as a
yes,
freelancer, it's like, god damn it, I just wasted all that time and I'm not getting paid for that, and now I'm behind on things, or it's yeah.
totally.
Mm.
It's funny. Like yesterday, I was thinking about this. I did like 6 hours of interviews yesterday for various, stories I'm working on, things I'm interested in. And I sat down at my computer today, and I just, I don't know, I had this simple realization of like, oh yeah, if you're a staff writer, you just get paid to do that. But like for me and for you, I got to make sure that those interviews are put to good use and that I get paid for them. And there's just this whole hustle around like, all right, I got to parlay those hours that I spent interviewing and make sure that I get enough. And, for me, that has meant a progressively higher per word rate. And, for projects, like I won't agree to them unless they're, higher in pay. And, there are times where I feel like editors will look, kind of give me the side eye, like, are you seriously asking that much? And I'm just like, yeah, absolutely, I am, because I've put so much work, just writing a freelance pitch. You've got to put work into interviews for that. And it's like, I got to make my money back here somehow, and
Yeah.
you never quite make it all back.
I've often, even this past week, this past year, I think I'm like, why don't I just like bartend and write novels? you know, it's like if I'm
Mm-hmm.
not gonna make any money from writing, I might as well do writing that I like find that kind of fun. so
I mean, yeah, like I feel like that's like, I have those thoughts like usually very late at night where I'm like, you know, I should just like go work at a bookstore, or I should do this other thing. And then like in the morning, I always convince myself like, no, no, I can't, like, I feel like journalism makes it that all my interactions with people are like, tell me your story. And it's like, I feel like I wouldn't be able to just like normally interact with people, like checking out their books or pouring a drink for them. I need too much, I think, from other people.
yeah, and it being the end of 2022 as we're talking, and this will come out in the early part of 2023. How do you metabolize the year that was so you can best plan for the year ahead?
Hmm. Interesting question. I mean, I am always thinking pretty far in advance. So I'm pretty booked as far as it's, into the next, I don't know, probably into the fall. I've pretty much know what I'm going to work on. So I'm kind of thinking past
Mm,
that.
mm.
But I'm looking back at like lessons learned. 2023 will be my 10th year as a freelancer. And I was just thinking about that this morning. Like, whoa, like what I just it's been a journey, and I feel like I still continue to learn a lot about, what projects are worth doing, how long things are going to take, where my interests lie. I think those are things that are shifting. There's a way to be a freelancer and I think stay on one beat, or there's a way to be a freelancer and just sort of follow your curiosity, and that's kind of how I am. So I think that that's kind of what I'm doing, looking into the next year, is being like, okay, 10 years of freelancing, like what is the next 10 going to look like for
Mm.
me?
Yeah, and what are some of those lesson learned that you think will help make the hopefully make the next 10 years fruitful and viable and scratch that itch of your ambition.
Um, Boy, I think that some of it is, I've been doing a lot on extremism, which I'm sure we'll talk about. That's taken the better part of the last 7 years or so for me, and I've learned so much. I've learned so much about the West. I've learned a lot about the people of the West, political movements, the political divide in America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I think that, but I feel my curiosity going in other directions. I used to do quite a lot of work based around like injustices, class divides, and police brutality, and religion, culture, subcultures within religion and things like that. So I kind of feel myself going back to those things, and feeling like I'm. It's not that I'm not interested in extremism. It's just that it's very much the most popular beat in America now, and I'm like kind of like, okay, I'm gonna go work on other things because this is like covered, I think. So I think that's one thing I've learned. I mean, I think, there's also business things you learn along the way, that projects take a really long time. Burn Wild, which we'll talk about, is took an excessive amount of time. It took too much time. And, that's something that as freelancers we have to account for, and that can be really difficult to know how to, because the story to me, its story's not done until the story's done. Like, I got to report it. It's got to be completely fleshed out. There are things that happen in reporting that you can't account for. And I think that's really where freelancers suffer, is that like a staff job, if a story pivots and it gets better or changes, you're still going to get a check. But for freelancers, it's like, then you're more just stretching a check out. So yeah, I think things like that, accounting for more time on stories, and always being more vigilant in my contracts. I think that's a thing I continue to learn with each progressive contract.
So as we you start thinking about Burn Wild and how it's going to manifest, yeah, at what point does the Earth Liberation Front and eco-terrorism get on your radar and you start to sink your teeth into it?
That's a great question. I mean, so I grew up in Oregon, and I was a high school student in the 90s and very much aware of the Earth Liberation Front. I mean, I grew up in liberal Portland, and went to a protest when I was like 16 years old. That was like a logging protest and things like that. So, like, I was just, it's something that's been around for a long time. I was aware that there was this kind of radical group, but like as a kid, you don't really know what that means, or at least a kid in the 90s, you didn't know what that meant. So, flash forward, much later, and I was doing an interview with a former FBI director, and I was interviewing him quite a few years ago about far right extremism and the Patriot movement and kind of these circles around the Bundy family. I was doing reporting for Bundyville at the time, um, and this, I said something, I can't remember exactly what my question was, but this person said, you know, don't forget about far left extremism. And I kind of looked at him and was like, what do you mean? Like, tell me what we're talking about here. This is around like 2016 we're talking. And he said, well, like eco-terrorists. And, I kind of logged it away in my mind because I was like, I'm not aware of any major acts of eco-terrorism, but maybe they just slipped past me. I've been focused on the far right. So it was something I really kept in my mind for quite a few years, kind of watching for instances of like eco-sabotage, tree spiking, all these things that I'd heard about as a young person, I didn't see anything. So when I kind of finished up 2 minutes past nine, which was a podcast I did with the BBC about the Oklahoma City bombing, I said to Georgia Cat, who is the producer on Burn Wild as well, I have this idea that I've kind of had in my mind for a while about doing something on eco-terrorism. Like, is that real? Is that actually a thing? Is that a factor right now? How much is law enforcement seeing that? And she was really intrigued. But what really got her, I think, was I had told her that, because this is the kind of person that I am, Brendan. Like, I keep an eye on like the FBI's most wanted list and like, things like that. And ages ago, I had been looking at it and I saw this woman on there, Josephine Sunshine Overacre, and saw that she was connected to some Earth Liberation Front actions in the 1990s in Oregon. And I was like, no way. Wow. Oregon, like the place I've always lived. So I just kind of logged that away in my mind. And there was also a man named Joseph Debay, and also connected to the same group with the Earth Liberation Front. And in 2018, he was caught using biometrics flying through Cuba. He'd been missing for like 12 years. So I tell Georgia, I'm really interested in the Earth Liberation Front, but they actually caught one of them. And so I think that there's something really interesting there if we could get an interview with this guy. So that's kind of how the whole thing began, was me kind of wanting to interrogate this thing that someone very high up in the FBI had said was a problem, and understand, is it a problem, but also look at this Oregon connection that I had access to in a way that other reporters wouldn't.
And not too long ago, you tweeted how you were able to get access and interviews to certain people who had turned down very high profile outlets, and this particular podcast really hinged on you getting very privileged access, specifically Joe Debay. So how did you lobby to get that degree of access that you needed to tell this particular story?
Well, I think it's just like a simple matter of not being a helicopter journalist. There were New York Times reporters that tried to do a story on the Earth Liberation Front last year, and like Joe Debay slammed the door in their face. And that was partially because the New York Times had printed wrong information about him in the past that he was very aware of, and he told them that. But it was also because he had an agreement with me. And so the reason I got that agreement was because Joe Debay's attorney was somebody that I knew from covering federal court in Oregon. So, he'd gotten calls, his attorney had gotten calls from, every big magazine and newspaper around, but he agreed to go with me because he knew my work, he knew my face. I'd interviewed him a ton of times. And so his attorney could say to Joe, look, these people want to make a podcast. This woman has a really good track record, and I know her, so I trust her. And I think that you're going to probably get the best shake from her. So, that's pretty amazing. Like, when does that ever happen to a freelancer?
Right.
But, it's just from being there. Yeah. Showing my face.
And now, so as you start to get access to principal figures, at what point do you start to, start the reporting and then kind of see how the story might play out? Like if you were to storyboard.
It was interesting because I knew early on that I was going to work on it with Georgia, and we had a conversation about it. She has an excellent podcast that she does. It's called The Missing Crypto Queen. It's about this woman who's also on the FBI's most wanted list, it turns out, who is, a crypto guru and is missing and swindled people out of millions of dollars, and the podcast is really her and the host kind of traipsing around the world, actually literally trying to find this woman. And so we had an early conversation about, could we apply that same sort of narrative model to Josephine Sunshine Overacre? And pretty quickly we were like, that is not possible because she has been missing for so long and the FBI has no idea where she is. There's no way in hell we're going to find her. Whereas, with the Missing Crypto Queen, she's much more recently disappeared. So we kind of scrapped that model, and it became about, well, let's focus on Joe, because Joe Debay has said he would do interviews with us. let's just really, really embed with him. And Georgia gave me a lot of space to do my interview style, which is, we're going to have quite a few conversations. These conversations are going to be hours long. And we just started getting to know him and trying to understand, what the movement looked like in retrospect through his eyes. He'd lived in Russia. He'd lived in Syria. He'd been through the Syrian war. He'd, had so much happen in his life that it really made us wonder, did he have feelings of regret about the things that he took part in? So that was kind of the beginning. And also I should say, it took a long time for Joe to even admit to us that he did what he did. And that might be a little bit of a spoiler. Sorry about that. But so yeah, that's kind of how the reporting started to take shape. Was okay, we started with Joe. We just started really organically. Then he would tell us some things. We go do some phone calls with other people, with other experts involved in extremism, with people in the environmental movement. And then at a certain point, it's like the reporting just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger because we had the American side of things. So we were like, Joe is one person. Who else could we get from the Earth Liberation Front that's maybe willing to talk? So we got Chelsea Gerlach, who had not spoken about what had happened, with the Earth Liberation Front and her time in prison. And then we got Daniel McGowan, who actually is the subject of an excellent documentary called When a Tree Falls. And, he was a little reluctant because I think that movie is really kind of, I think, the end all be all of his story. But, he was intrigued that here was the BBC calling and wanting to put a little bit more of a global perspective on it, but also revisit it after so much, these events after so much time. So we built all the reporting about the American movement. And then we started kind of looking wider, at Extinction Rebellion in the UK, at Just Stop Oil, all these different kind of movements that have really, really been taking hold in the UK, and just asking bigger and bigger questions because we realize that this, like, the reason to do this story in this moment is obviously this pressing threat of climate change. Well, that's not an Oregon problem. That's not restricted to the forests of Oregon like, the conversation was in the 1990s. So, it's a global problem. And so we kind of had this mantra that we really repeat over and over again through the podcast of like, how far is too far to go to save the planet? And that was really born out of the reporting of just talking to people about what they did and how they feel about it, and them all being really reflective of like, I I served hard prison time. It was horrible. It ruined my life what I did. But also, I don't think I was totally wrong for doing it because look at the state that we're in right now with climate change. So that's kind of how it all started to kind of come together, was like these puzzle pieces sort of slowly falling into place.
Now, when you say that, the reporting was getting like bigger and bigger and bigger, how do you and Georgia wrap your heads around it and organize it? Because it is like there are puzzle pieces and they're all over the place. You don't know when one might fit, one might not fit. So how are you keeping your head around everything as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger?
That's a great question. I mean, it's part of the reason I think that it took so long for us to make this. Was it wasn't just the story of one person. It could have been just about Joe, but it's like you can't really tell the story fully if you're just focusing on one person. So yeah, I mean, it kind of became like this. We had a pretty scattershot method, I will say. It's a lot different than doing your reporting all on your own, and you can kind of use your own systems. Like, we had a really big challenge in that, we're pretty different reporters, and we also live 8 hours apart from each other. So, like, for a while, I would say the reporting was a little all over the place. It's like we had, some of Joe, we had some of Chelsea, we had some of Daniel, we had a bunch of stuff about, just environmentalism over a 30-year period, and, so much stuff. But I think what really was the thing that made us kind of click into place is that when COVID restrictions lifted, Georgia was able to fly into the US for the first time. So she came to Oregon for 2 weeks. And we basically spent that entire 2 weeks, like 10 plus hours a day together, like reporting, driving around, writing, like kind of figuring out like how this is going to all come together into a narrative. So, I mean, it is kind of funny because it's like, there was something about it just being physically in the same place. I think was one thing, but podcast narratives, I think it's a real kind of, it can be hard, but I think that what we really hung it on was Oregon and the ELF. So like throughout the series, you kind of get these snippets of like rural Oregon or Eugene. Obviously, we have a whole episode devoted to Eugene, and like I think that those things allowed us to kind of put a little bit of boundaries on the reporting. Like, okay, we need to get to Eugene and we need to talk about why Eugene is important, but why what happened in Eugene ripples out across the world and stuff. So it was kind of that, putting these sort of Oregon colored glasses on and then just seeing everything through that.
And when you're start reporting too, at what point do you start to think about the structure of how you want to organize the entire scope of the story?
So we knew that people needed a character to follow for this to be interesting. Like we couldn't be talking about people and unless their voices were being heard. So we really, I think when we got the interviews with Joe and then got interviews with Chelsea and Daniel, we knew that there would be sort of this like triple character braid kind of throughout the podcast. So you could kind of follow their stories. So I think and then we built around that. Well, where was there a common place that, Chelsea and Daniel both lived, but also several people lived? Okay, Eugene, the government accused both Chelsea and Daniel of having to do with a fire at a tree farm out in Clatskanie, Oregon. So it's like, okay, well, we got to go to Clatskanie. So they kind of became these sort of the narrative was sort of formed around the people and the places, and everything else kind of filled in from there. Because that's what I would want to listen to in a podcast is I want to hear voices. I want to get those like textural elements, of in the woods and that kind of thing. So we knew, and we really knew that we wanted to create a podcast that was like had a lot of nature sounds and like birds and snow and trees and wind and things like that. So it was like we had this sort of palette of people, places, and sounds. And we thought, like, how do we write to that? And, to me, I feel like I'm such like an artist about writing. That was like a great challenge for me, was like, okay, like, so make it narrative now. Like, how do we do that? That probably doesn't make any sense, but it does to me.
Yeah. Well, because of the soundscape and everything you were able to accomplish, it did strike me as a very like immersive experience.
Yeah, and that was the intent, is that we really wanted it to feel, Georgia and I both are pretty voracious listeners to podcasts, and neither of us could think of one that had largely like a soundtrack of nature, and we thought, these are the things that'll be lost by climate change, our bird sounds and trees and things like that. We also have this sort of landscape of fire sounds that go throughout. And so we were kind of trying to tell a little bit of a story there of like, fire interacting with nature and birds in trees and that vacant space when they're gone and stuff. So we did know, we put a lot of expectations on this podcast as far as like getting interviews people couldn't get, getting access where other people had trouble, doing things with the music and the story. And, it was a great challenge. And I think it tired us both out though, because it was like, we both we put our whole lives into it. So, when something like that is done, you're just like, boy. I mean, you and I have been talking about this. You're just like, God, I don't know if I can do that again.
Right. Well, you were talking about like how long it took you guys in terms of the reporting. And of course, there's the writing and the editing and everything that goes along with producing it. And like in the end, you're dealing with like, basically right around 8 hours of content that can be literally listened to in a day. And you're like, spent like over a year, if not like about 2 years, working on this. So
Yeah.
that's got to be like,
Yeah.
it's just like all that work for like what amounts to very little end product in terms of,
Right.
and it's
Yeah.
just like, oh my God.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, like I can't even tell you how many hours and hours of interviews we just have with just Joe DeBay. And we have hours of interviews with people that didn't even go in the podcast. Like, um, so, but that's what reporting is, and I think that this is where the podcast medium is so tricky business wise, is that podcast companies want to make sure that they've got a sure bet with the story that you're telling, but good journalism happens from figuring it out. And that was one thing the BBC really allowed Georgia and I to do, is they give us a lot of space to figure it out on our own, and go where the story needed to go. And they weren't going to force us to go, like I said, traipse around the world and trying to find a fugitive that the FBI can't find. Like they wanted to make sure that we were telling the right story that needed to be told in this moment to advance the conversation beyond the kind of true crime narrative, and look at the bigger takeaways. Um, so yeah, I mean, but that just takes a really long time. Then do it with an 8-hour time difference.
Right.
So there were times where Georgia was staying up until 3 in the morning to do interviews. There were times that I was waking up at 5 in the morning so we could talk on the phone before a bunch of interviews that we needed to do in the morning and stuff. So it became this sort of like really, really rigorous process, and it was like a daily call that we had to have to kind of say, all right, what do we need next? What have we got? Like, where are we going? And both of us are living, mostly in COVID for this. And so we'd like kind of lament to each other, like, maybe the BBC should like pay you to come live in Oregon, or maybe the BBC would like pay for me to come live in London for a little bit so we can just sit in the same room and figure this damn thing out.
Yeah,
That didn't happen.
right. Well, there was at one point, it's been a while since I listened to it, but there was a hat tip where you're like, you would be drinking your morning coffee and she would be on her glass of wine, and it's like,
Yeah.
that's it's like it's a really kind of like cute storytelling choice to like put in, because you're like, it shows like how you guys are on different parts of the planet trying to work on this thing. It's one of those things too that it doesn't necessarily advance the narrative, but it is nice color. So like, I wonder, just even for a small decision like that, why you elect to include some people be like, yeah, that's really cool, and I think it's really funny, and it gave you guys a little snippet of your personality. And some people will be like, no, take it out, because what does it really serve in your global warming piece?
Yeah.
So I don't know, just
Totally, yeah. I think that there was it was important, it was the second project that Georgia and I had worked on together, and we'd sort of established it's this very unique thing that to my life. I don't know if this has happened with anybody else, but it became this really reliable working friendship that I had that was born in COVID. Like, for the majority of the time that I've known Georgia, it has been through a Zoom screen, and we just became a big part of each other's lives because work became so big during COVID. We were all at home, working all the time. Well, it just so happened I was working with somebody who lives halfway around the planet. So I think that there was a bit of anticipation in the first time that we would meet each other and see and talk. But I will say that when we both heard the Trojan Horse Affair, which was the Serial podcast made by Brian Reed and can't remember the UK journalist's name.
see, isn't this the beauty about these little asides, these little interjections? The journalist that Leah is referring to, and I will likely butcher the pronunciation, but the journalist's name is Hamza Syed. Trojan Horse Affair.
But they were doing a similar thing, and we heard that and thought, wasn't that interesting? Like, that they worked in this sort of goofy good cop bad cop relationship between this American and British reporter. And we talked a lot about what use that had to that narrative. I don't know if you've heard that podcast,
Not yet.
but
No.
it's a big part of the podcast. It's a big part of them realizing what the story is. And so we started, we'd already been recording our phone calls at that point. it just was something that we did early on in our process. But we thought, maybe it's more interesting for people to hear two female reporters who are writing about extremism, which is a pretty risky beat, and seeing what that looks like through our lens. Maybe that will be more interesting for people, or interesting in the same ways that the Trojan Horse affair was. So there was a bit of inspiration there in trying to kind of capture that. And yeah, I don't know, somehow I've become a character in a lot of the audio projects I've done, and I think it's just that I have a pretty off the cuff style, and Georgia really kind of liked that. And so I think I was like, well, I'm not going to be the only character in this thing. Like, you're coming in with me then, because we've worked on this together. It's truly half and half. So so that's some of the logic behind it.
Yeah, there was a moment too where like it was like you had seen each other for the first time off a Zoom screen, and she came up to you. She's like, "Wow, you're tall." Like,
Yeah, we were both struck. I mean, I am like 5'10", so I usually am like the tallest woman in most rooms that I'm in, and it was just so funny. That was the first thing we both noticed, is that we were the exact same height, and we hadn't asked each other, how tall are you? So it was really funny.
now, a key component of a huge component of the whole series is this idea of labeling the perpetrators of the eco-terrorism as like stone cold terrorists, and this really plays pivotal roles in how long they're put away, even though their acts of violence didn't kill any person or really any animal. So I don't know, just speak to that and the importance of that, and as that bubbled up to the surface in the story that you were telling.
Well, I think it's born out of that initial conversation I had with the person that was formerly in the FBI. Don't forget about eco-terrorists. And um, I think that what we started to realize is that, the FBI deeply, deeply wanted to get Joe DeBay, and they still very much want to get Josephine Sunshine Overacre. I mean, we have that FBI agent in the podcast saying, like, I don't want to retire until I get her. Like, that would be the cap on my career, is to find this person. So that was struck me because we have seen so many acts of domestic terrorism in the past few years. When Georgia and I were working on 2 minutes past 9, January 6th happened. We recorded in real time our reflections on that, and that was a part of that podcast, was that looking at the 25-year on legacy of the Oklahoma City bombing. Then January 6th happens as we're making that podcast. Like, it felt very much hand in hand with the legacy of Oklahoma City. So our focus had been seeing, all these acts of, domestic terror. January 6th, the takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, the standoff at Bundy Ranch. Like, there's been so many things that have happened that have been armed takeovers. People have lost their lives. Police officers lost their lives at January 6th. But then we also were getting into the history of white supremacist motivated mass shootings. So, like, in El Paso, Texas, and in Buffalo, and in, Charleston at the church with Dylan Roof. Like, and what we started to see was that around January 6th, there was a lot of talk about that not being terrorism. This is something we're still talking about today. That the El Paso shooter still has not been charged with terrorism, that the Buffalo shooter, there was debate whether or not he would be charged with terrorism. These were people who committed their acts of violence because of their expressed racially motivated ideology. So we wanted to talk about, how does that square up with a bunch of people who burn some buildings down? We're not saying that that's not a crime, but should it be called terrorism? So much of our reporting became about trying to understand how the word terrorism gets applied by the Department of Justice, by the FBI, by police, and by the public. And at a certain point, we realized that the term eco-terrorism had, by many accounts, been purchased by industry, by very powerful lobbyists who said, these acts are, they're hurting our business, and politicians heard that. And that was something that we heard in our reporting quite a lot, with people who'd worked in Homeland Security, with people who worked on this case in the FBI, who said there was political pressure to get these people. And that was a point of, obviously, of curiosity for Georgia and I, but at a certain point, particularly for me, it became a very big point of anger, because I've been working on stories of far right extremism for a long time, and have seen, not as many consequences as one might think. And then to look at sort of what had happened with the Earth Liberation Front, it was, there was a big disparity there. So yeah, that really ends up being the focus of the podcast. It's like, what is terrorism? What is terrorism, in the mind of the law, but also in the mind of the public, in this kind of post 9/11 world? Like, what does that look like? Um, so yeah, it was a fascinating thought experiment.
And you're someone who is, I would say your body of work obviously is primarily written and, print based, web based. So when you're
Mhm.
doing narrative audio, how does your writing change, especially as you look to integrate the quotes, which are literal tape?
It's a great question. It's been something that has been probably one of the funnest challenges for me, is to try to, typically, not only, like you said, is my body of work written, but it's like long written stories, like 10,000 word stories. And when I made Bundyville, I had really, really good teachers in the producers of that podcast, who kind of taught me how to write for radio, which was not a thing that I knew how to do. And what I learned is, it's like, you've got to be able to talk. You've got to write like you talk, but you also have to be able to explain complex issues to people conversationally, while also not talking down to them.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of like this kind of like, it's a real like, all right, now try to boil down your story that you would typically write 10,000 words to a, 2-minute bit. And so it's very difficult, but to me, I think that that's like, it's a really good challenge. I think it makes you a better writer. I used to work for an alt weekly back in the day, and they'd be like, okay, we're going to put out our like best of the city issue, and you have to write about the best barista and the best laundromat and the best like, bartender and stuff, and you've got 50 words. I always thought of that as like a really fun writing experiment, is like, you got to write something punchy in 50 words. And I think that, like, that's kind of a little bit of what podcasting feels like to me, is like trying to, not change the meaning of it, not overly like sexify something, but like just talk to people like you're at their kitchen table. You just tell them a story. And yeah, I find that very fun, very frustrating, but very fun.
Yeah. And also just logistically, when you're working in print, and if you have to like move a quote around, or even like, massage out some of like the verbal tics or whatever, that's really easy. And if you need to be like, oh, this makes more sense higher in the story or lower in the story, it's an easy cut and paste. With audio,
Hmm.
it's much more complicated. And I'm not even a super
Hmm.
duper producer. I've done a little audio storytelling where I have to do clip audio here and there, and it's a pain in the ass. It's
Hmm.
very hard because there are a lot of moving parts. Like literally, you got to be really delicate with how you move around the audio. So, what was
Yeah.
what was that process like for you? Since your episodes contain so much tape, so much narration,
Hmm.
and it's a lot of strips across your DAW. Before we let Leah even answer that question, let me explain what a DAW or DAW is. It's a digital audio workstation. My DAW is Hindenburg. Some people use Pro Tools. Other people use Audacity. So that is what a DAW is. It's basically Microsoft Word or a Google Doc for your audio story.
Yeah. It's interesting, because the process of writing Bundyville and 2 Minutes Past 9 were very different than writing Burn Wild. So with those podcasts, it was like, okay, what's the story we're telling? And I would kind of go through and write the script and think, okay, this quote would be good here, this good quote would be good there. And it was pretty straightforward. It was almost like writing a story. But with Burn Wild, actually, Georgia took the first pass at the scripts in that she would roughly say, I think that this is the flow of the audio that's going to make the most sense. So now build a story around that. And, obviously this is after we knew, okay, the third episode is going to be about Josephine Sunshine Overacre. Fourth episode is going to be about XYZ. So, but that was kind of the process. It was reversed. It didn't quite make sense to me the way we were doing it that way, but in the end it did, because like you say, it's like you kind of, there's a part of me that thinks that you can kind of hear the story if you took out if you took out all of my narration and you only heard the quotes, you would hear the same story that we're telling. So it's about filling in those gaps usefully and in a way that supplements what our sources had already been telling us.
Yeah, and then there's you've talked about Sunshine, and you introduced her early in the run, and I remember when usually when a name gets introduced, you're like, okay, that's gonna matter. And because she's been on the lam for so long, you're like, maybe in this story, like, they're gonna find her. And it's just one of those things. I'm like, all right, are they going to or are they not? And spoiler alert, she's still on the lam. You don't find her. So
Yeah.
so for you, when you make the decision to put her in as something of a MacGuffin, and she's not found in the end, so there isn't that like nice clean payoff of like, here's this thing that came up and like, oh, we're gonna find her in the end. So like, how did you like kind of navigate around that, knowing that you didn't find her, but still make it satisfying, like sort of arc to your story, even though she doesn't factor in the way that would be like a neat little bow?
Yeah. Well, I think that there was a few things. We did want people to think there was a chance that we might find her, because we were certainly wanted to leave ourselves open to that possibility. I do remember a journalist friend of mine halfway through the series coming out, she was like, "Oh, you're gonna find her. I know it. I know it." Like, and I was like, "Oh no, people think we're gonna find her. Like, is that wrong?" You know, but here's the thing. I also have a lot of experience writing about people that I have not talked to. So like, quite a few years ago, I wrote a profile for Outside about the last man standing at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge occupation. And, that story was assembled from phone calls that he'd made to the FBI, my interviews with his family. I wrote a bunch for Rolling Stone about a politician that I just couldn't get any access to, but there was a ton on the public record about him. So, when it became clear to Georgia and I that there was no way in hell we were going to find Sunshine, that's kind of what I said to her. It's like, look, just because we can't get an interview with this lady does not mean we can't write about her, because certainly people have, but I think that we can apply my expertise of extremism to her story, and then try and talk to people about her, try and understand as much as we humanly can about her, and I think that we'll be able to tell a different story. So and then just being the kind of reporter I am, I mean, I was like pulling up high school yearbooks. I'm like pulling out all the stops and everything I could possibly think of like what might contribute to our knowledge of who this person was, because anything that's ever been written about her starts and ends with those arsons. And I'm like, but she was a person before that happened. She was in her 20s. So who was she? Where was she from? What kind of family was she from? Where'd she go to high school? What was her best friend's name? What'd she like to do with her time? And there was just still so many questions that I feel like I had about her, that it became kind of an exercise in trying to like almost write a profile of her without ever having talked to her. And then obviously we got an interview in the end that made that secure for Georgia and I. I mean, and that interview really like did come chronologically at the tail end of our process. Like, the ending would have been completely different had we not gotten that interview.
Yeah, I'm always curious when over the course of, be it a magazine story or in the case of a podcast of this nature, when certain repertorial bits came in the course of the process? Like, did you, I was having this conversation with Michael Schulman, who wrote a really nice profile on James Corden a while ago, and there was like a closing quote, and I was just like, it's such a great closing quote. And I asked him, like, did that come at like the end of your reporting? Like, or was that something he said in the first 5 minutes you were talking and you were like, kind of like earmark it, like, oh, that has the resonance of an ending, and you put it in your pocket for the ending. And it sounds like, probably that email you got from Sunshine's mother, it sounded like it came late in the process. And I imagine that throws a complete wrench into the entire arc of your story.
Well, I mean, so really, as people hear what happens in Burn Wild, that's the chronology that it
Oh,
happened
okay,
in.
okay.
And so much is it for us was knowing, like you asked earlier about our relationship is included in the story, but also kind of our thought processes as we're trying to kind of untangle these knots. It was like untangling a big, gnarl of Christmas lights. Like, how do we make these things, like, how do we straighten this whole thing out? So yes, about halfway through the process, I had been hunting just about as hard as I could for Sunshine's mom, and I felt like I had found her, and I'd been asking every person I could possibly think of about Sunshine, and to this day I still don't know who told her that I was looking for her, but she signed up for my newsletter, for my Substack newsletter. I got this, so I got a sign up, and it's weird because I don't usually read like all the sign up, the emails that I get. Somebody signed up for your newsletter, but for whatever reason on that day I did, and I was like, first and last name. Uh, I don't want to give away her email address, but I was just like, no way. And I just sent the email. Like usually I would ask Georgia, like, hey, I got this email. Do you think I should? But I just sent an email and was like, call me crazy here, but are you Josephine Sunshine Overacre's mom? And she wrote back and was like, yeah, I am. But that happened about a year and a couple of months before we actually got an interview with her. So, you know, much of that year was me talking to her on the phone and saying, like, here's what I'm trying to do, and kind of gaining her trust, but also just telling her about what we were working on. I mean, I think she's I've written a lot in the past about missing persons, and I have a deep awareness of the trauma that creates in families who don't know if their family members are alive or if they're missing, or if they are in need of help. And so I realized pretty quickly that was kind of what I was dealing with Sunshine's mom, was like, this is a woman who lost her daughter, and she has no idea if she's alive. And really, this is like a re-traumatizing thing for her. And at a certain point she said she didn't want to do an interview, and I left her alone for quite a while. And then, towards the end, we were kind of finishing up the project, and Georgia and I were like, she's pretty cool, like maybe we could ask her one more time. And we went around and around on if that was ethical or if we were really going to be bugging this lady, and we landed on asking her, and that was the thing. She agreed. She was like, yeah, you're right, I do want to talk about this. I do want to be a part of your project. So it was just one of those things that made us really happy that we had included so much of the sausage being made process, because I think that the listener then is like, well, you didn't find Sunshine, but you found just about as close as you could get to her. And that's, I think, kind of satisfying to hear from her.
Yeah, and I believe you basically give her the final word in the entire series too. Is that
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Because what we realized is, like, these questions that we were asking, they're questions that apply to protest movements. They apply to, all of a sudden Roe v. Wade kind of takes this big seat at the end of our project about environmental activism. And that's because, I think part of Elsbeth and I's conversations was us sharing frustration, not journalist to subject, but woman to woman, about what was happening in the United States. And I shared with her my frustration about Roe, and she was like, that kind of has actually something to do with this kind of greater story that you're trying to tell here. It's about, this is reminiscent of the Vietnam War protests that I participated in, and the reproductive rights protests that I participated in. And Sunshine comes from that legacy of people pushing back against power. And George and I just realized, like, there's nothing we could say that would be better than that, that would be have more weight. And I think that that was effective, you know? I mean, I think that we've heard from a lot of different types of people who heard the project, and a lot of people who started out hearing the series and saying, these people are arsonists and they're terrorists. And those same people at the end of the series would be like, wow, much more complicated than I realized. And, you know, they could share in Elsbeth's pride, I think, of her daughter.
And when you're out reporting with for radio or podcasting, it's a slightly different hardware situation, and I'm always amazed at like, or not amazed, but like I'm always like, when do they hit record? Because oftentimes it's like you're catching a lot of things, and you're catching like people approaching you from afar. I'm like, all right, I think Jonathan Goldstein for Heavyweight, he has a thing. He's like, always be recording. So like, I think for him, like if he's right, even before he knocks on someone's door, he's got his recorder on. And is that the fundamental thing? It's just like you got to turn that on. Your memory card's empty, your batteries are full. Turn that shit on.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. Like, I think that, you know, I have this sort of luxury that I always get to pretty much always get to work with a producer on the podcasts that I work on, you know. And I think that I would say on Bundyville, Ryan Hass was generally recording about 20 minutes before we got somewhere. He would want to, okay, let's start talking about what we're going to be doing, you know, let's start getting that audio. I will say that Georgia Cat starts recording about an hour before.
Oh, wow.
I mean, so it's like she has a much different technique of like capturing. Um, I mean, it's really cool to see the way that she works. Like this, you know, she's the kind of person that's going to have a mic, you know, to the wheel of the car and be like, okay, back up. You know, it's like she's the kind of person that would you like go to the sort of nth degree to capture sound of the interviews, of the you know, the atmospheric kind of ambient sounds of conversations and stuff. I mean, I bet that she has on some sort of like probably half broken BBC computer, probably hundreds of hours of audio for that reason, but it gives her a very big, wide palette to work with.
And as the story comes to a close and you put a bow on your final episodes, you know, there comes the moment too of the sort of the post publication gauntlet of having to promote the thing and getting in front of people. You know, this is kind of a part of the process I think people sometimes are uncomfortable with, or they don't really talk about very much. So I know for you who, you know, what is, you know, this moment like when you've published it and now it's like, okay, we need to get this out into the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's been different for every project that I've worked on, you know, books, articles, podcasts. And I would say that for this one, weirdly, it is slightly low impact on me because we have to remember this is being put out by the
Mm-hmm.
BBC. So for the most part, it is being promoted where the BBC broadcasts, which is, you know, half of the world, but not as much here in the United States. So there's a lot of interviews that Georgia does. There's a lot of you know, promotion over on that side of the world. But less so over here, which, you know, I've done quite a few interviews, of course, on like, you know, promotion and things like that, but it is kind of a little bit of a slow burn of a promotion effort. It's not quite the blitz that I've experienced with other things. And I have to say I'm a little bit happy with that because I think both of us were so tired when it was done. So, but we also know it has a long tail. Like this is relevant for as long, you know, as for as long as people are going to use the term eco-terrorist, for as long as climate change is an issue, this is going to be relevant. So um we tried to create something that would be timely and not, you know, have a quick expiration date on it.
And just a couple more things, Leah. And you know, just as you know, as you wind up the project, something that took so much time and bandwidth, and you know, it's finally out. What's the level of like sort of enthusiasm or energy you have to like to start anew for the next project, given how much time, you know, something of this, you know, takes from you and drains you. You know, does it leave you full or more drained?
Drained. I mean, energy, yeah, not a lot. Like I don't know how quick I would be to run to make another podcast. And that's just simply because they are a ton of work. We would often sort of say that, I put out a book last June, and I wrote that book faster than we made Burn Wild. And I think that, that's a 320-page book. Like, and that's just, it's because of, I think, some of the hurdles we were dealing with, COVID, 8-hour time difference, literally working around the world from each other. There was a lot there, but we were also following Joe Dibe's case, and that was playing out in the courts. So we basically created the most complicated reporting experience we could for ourselves, and I think that that's really satisfying in the end. But like you say, somebody can binge it in a day and it's done.
Yeah.
So I think that that's, the payoff of podcasts can be kind of small, and it, like, the first question you asked me is like, why do we do this? And I think that, with each project I take on, I have to think about afterwards, like, how effective was that? In a way, I think that Burn Wild is insanely effective. I think it's prompted conversations that people didn't realize we needed to have. We wanted to create a podcast about climate change that was less about ice caps melting. I don't mean to sound like, crude or anything, but like less about wildlife dying and more about like how people are going to handle this, and if they are, and how, what happens when people take things into their own hands. So yeah, I think that, we created the project that we wanted to, but I think that, the podcast industry is just so topsy turvy in terms of like, there are people that get paid millions of dollars to work on shows, and then there are people who pay for their shows out of their own pocket, and there's not a whole lot in between. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, I like to podcast. I do think that audio is a very rich medium for storytelling, and it's very powerful. But I can't be paying for it by myself, and that's a tough choice to maybe have to make. But I'm also pretty tired from Burn Wild.
Yeah, absolutely. But it was such a satisfying experience, and
Good.
yeah, and I think the Duffer Brothers, the Stranger Things guys, like that's something they've lamented too. It's like they spend so long putting these seasons together, and then like people watch it in a day, and they're like, God damn! It's like it's like
It's like, what a compliment, but also savor it.
yeah, exactly. So I think they long for the day of like the week to week thing where you can watch it and then digest it and talk about it instead of just this total binge culture, which sometimes I think does a disservice to just the titanic amount of work that goes into it. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, but like a good book that sometimes I say like if a book like the writing or the production should be like that's an uphill process, so the reading and the consuming of it can be a downhill process. So I think it's a
Yeah.
testament to people like yourself who put in all that effort, that uphill work, that it listens and it flows so well is a testament to how well you did it, because that we can listen to it in a day or 2 days or 3 days and want more is a testament to how your skill as a reporter and a writer. And it was truly a pleasure to hear you again take on such a thing.
I'm glad. I am glad to hear that. It's one of those things that we finish, I get very postpartum about long-term projects.
Yeah.
When I'm done with them, I just kind of don't know what to do with myself afterwards. But I finished up Burn Wild, and I was like, yeah, I think I'm done. I think I'm not going to do any podcasts anymore. And then, of course, I spend, around the holidays doing a lot of baking and listening to podcasts. And I listened to that great podcast, Bone Valley, which is just stunning. I mean, it's a perfect podcast in my opinion. And I was like, damn it, now I got to make another podcast because it's so good. It inspired me to, like, keep going with it. And I think that that's, you do see that podcasting can be really powerful. It's just really, really powerful way to deliver a story that people might not otherwise read. So I don't want to make light of that, because it is a hard process, but it's like, it is very, when it works, it really works. It works on me. So
Yeah, and it's just I guess the real challenge in the end is like you'd probably be more open to do it if you had like a steady, if it paid better, or
yeah,
like I mean it's
it's just that
it's an
simple.
asinine thing to say, but it's one of those things where like the drain of it be like, oh, it's okay. Like if I have a bad reporting day, I don't feel like I just like ate it. It's just
Yeah,
I know I'm getting
right.
paid.
It would be
Yeah.
rad. It would be rad to be like, I had a bad reporting day. I'm gonna go on vacation. I'll come back refreshed. But it's like, no, you don't get that as a freelance podcast producer. You just end up being tired and then being like, well, that's done. Better get on working on
I
something
know. Yeah.
else. It's
Would you be
brutal.
seduced by some like a staff position of some kind, or are you like or like addicted to the
I
freedom?
don't know. I mean, yeah, I always say, I may have made this analogy to you before, but it's like I always say I'm like an outdoor cat. Like I just like can't go in again.
Yeah.
Like I just have seen the outside. Um, and I do think that that's true to some sense. I think the journalism staff jobs are pretty, yeah, like if somebody wanted to like dangle an attractive salary, but I had to like never be home because I had to be on a plane all the time or something like that. I think that there's just a certain life benefits that I see that I get from freelancing that do feel good for me. But yeah, no, I mean, I can never say never. Like I think if there was a staff job out there that fit my unique skill set, then I certainly would have to consider it. I mean, I would like to maybe retire one day.
I know. Oh my God.
I mean, on the track that I'm on, that's not happening. So, which is fine. It's good that I'm obsessed with journalism. I'll do it until I'm dead.
Well, awesome, Leah. Well, this is always a pleasure. I love whenever I see the Leah Sottile byline and hear your voice coming through the podcast airwaves. It always brings a smile to my face, and I know I'm in, and
Hell
I know I'm
yeah.
in for a good ride. So, just thank you so much for everything you do and for your work and insights into freelancing and freelance journalism too. It's all so valuable.
Well, thank you, Brendan. I really appreciate you, being like that because, as you know, it's like it can feel lonely sometimes. So that means a lot. I appreciate it.
Oh man, that was great. Leah's great. You're great. Thanks for listening and for making it this far. If you liked it, if you liked what you heard, go ahead and share it across your networks. Link up to the show on social. Spread it hand to hand. That's how this show has grown for nearly 10 years. That's how it's going to have to continue to grow. And always consider subscribing to my monthly newsletter for book recommendations, links to helpful, inspiring articles, an exclusive happy hour. It's how we rage against the algorithm. As you know, it does go from here and it goes up to 11. First of the month, no spam. Can't beat it. So I was deciding whether or not I should riff on my book proposal journey as it stands. My agent sent it to an editor at HarperCollins last week, and the editor is interested. He says, quote, "I'm enjoying this," end quote, which is pretty amazing in and of itself. That said, it's not a green light. Far from it. Editor goes on to ask some central questions I failed to answer in a satisfactory way, and I hope what you glean from this is what you might have to do with your own book proposals. Pretty rare to get this kind of feedback, to even get this far in the process, if you ask me. And I want to share some of these insights. Now, there's a huge possibility of rejection here. I'm going to refrain from including the name of my subject, but the questions are relevant nevertheless. Okay, here we go. So this is the note from the editor. I would love to talk some things through with Brendan in a call. Most importantly, I want to better understand the new material he expects to uncover and how it will enhance, undermine, sustain the existing mythology. I'd like to get a clearer sense of the point of view that Brendan is bringing to this narrative. What does he think is misunderstood about the subject? How has the popular narrative failed? Why is this corrective needed to better understand his place in sports history? The anniversary is a great hook, but I think this book needs a larger sense of purpose. Why tell this story again? Now. Also, I'd like to really understand his vision for putting his story onto a bigger canvas. a la Jane Levy. I agree he's a figure that can support that, but I think it needs to be handled with a certain finesse. Given how much has been written about the counterculture of the 60s and 70s, it feels easy for this to go sideways. But I think if done right, there is a way to marry this larger cultural context to the revisionist POV that Brendan is offering. So those are some great questions, right? I think you'll really want to consider those questions as you patch together your proposals and maybe save yourself months of agony and rewrites and frustrating the fucking pants off your agent for not being able to satisfactorily answer them. I have about 5 days or so to meditate on these questions and essentially draw up a PowerPoint, if you will, kind of like going on Shark Tank. And I'm going to be sitting in front of Mark Cuban and company to pitch this book. That's what you're doing. You're in front of essentially investors. You're asking for money and for publication, and they want a return on that investment. Makes sense. Sure, it's art, but it's also a product in the same way a thermos is. You have to believe in it so hard, and you have to check off the boxes because of all that risk involved. Those questions, I think those are pretty standard, across the board. They might change a little bit, but I think those are pretty standard animating forces for certainly biography in the case of what I'm doing. Those are what an actual, real, live, breathing book editor at a major publisher wants to see answered. And I'd say if you can answer those questions, then you're in good shape. My meeting is Thursday, so I likely won't have an update come next week's pod, but you better believe I'll be fretting these next few days as I try to be assertive and speak with conviction. Otherwise, if you can do, interview. See ya.